The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the heavy glass doors of Cedar Creek Medical at 5:51 a.m., 6 months into a life that wasn't hers. Her badge read RN Sullivan, nothing more. The credential was real. The name was real. Everything else was classified. She moved through the empty corridor with the kind of purposeful silence that people rarely noticed, the kind that came from walking through places where loud got you killed. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable. Her hands were steady. That's what they saw. That's what they were supposed to see. The antiseptic smell hit first, sharp and clean, cutting through the darker notes of industrial coffee and something vaguely floral from the lobby flowers that had started to decay 2 days ago. She'd noticed. Most people didn't. Most people didn't catalogue the small breakdowns in a space. She did. Captain Brooke Sullivan had spent 14 months cataloguing breakdowns in Ramadi, structural, tactical, human, and the hospital was no different. Just slower. Her locker was in the third-floor staff room, 4th row, number 247. She opened it without looking at the combination lock. Muscle memory from a different life. Her civilian jacket hung inside, brown canvas, the kind a nurse might wear to and from a double shift. But sewn inside the lining, visible only if someone knew to look, was the faded unit patch from the 160th SAW Night Stalkers. Black background. Gold lettering. The only physical token of who she really was. She touched it once, her fingers finding the embroidered edge as if it might disappear. Then she closed the door. The sound was soft. Everything about Brooke Sullivan was soft now. 6 months in. 184 days of answering to orders that weren't orders, of standing in rounds with her shoulders squared when everyone else slouched, of charting with the kind of precision that belonged in a military medical record, not a civilian hospital. The Navy SEAL in room 314 was her assignment. Not her patient. Not a person. A mission asset whose name she wasn't supposed to think about and whose classified intelligence about a compromised operation in Ramadi was worth more than her entire cover identity. He'd been admitted 10 weeks ago with blast injuries to his left lung and a shattered humerus. The official chart said motorcycle accident. The real story lived in classified files she couldn't access from this floor. She started with the morning vitals, moving between rooms with the rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Room 307, Mrs. Chen, post-op appendectomy, vital stable, eating soft foods, discharge likely by noon. Room 310, Mr. Garrett, diabetic neuropathy admission, blood glucose 287, still hypertensive. Room 312, empty, being cleaned. Room 313, Mr. Patel, cardiac monitoring, EKG rhythm strip normal sinus, no complaints. Room 314, the Navy SEAL. His name was in the chart. She never used it. He was awake when she entered, morning light cutting through the window blinds and laying sharp shadows across his face. His left arm was in a shoulder immobilizer. His breathing was even, mechanical, taught by someone who understood how to control the body when the body wanted to scream. She recognized that control. She'd taught it to others. "Morning, Captain," he said, then caught himself. "Morning. Sorry." Habit. She didn't respond to the slip. There was no slip, as far as anyone listening was concerned. She just checked the fall line, noting the flow rate, the date on the saline bag, the position of the catheter. 14 hours old. No signs of infiltration. Her hands moved with the kind of efficiency that should have seemed normal for a nurse but felt wrong when you understood the context. This wasn't efficiency. This was surgical precision. This was someone who had removed shrapnel from a human chest cavity under blackout conditions in a combat hospital where the power kept failing. "How's the pain?" she asked, keeping her voice level, quiet, the voice of a civilian nurse. "4," he said. "Could be worse. Could be better." She made a note on his chart. Her handwriting was small, precise, medical school caliber, which was the problem. Captain Brooke Sullivan had attended the Naval Academy, then Johns Hopkins for accelerated nursing. That wasn't information that should be findable in her background. That's why the cover was perfect. That's why it was dangerous. Dr. Mercer entered the ward at 6:15 a.m., the way he always did, like a man who knew every eye would track him. He was tall, mid-50s, with the kind of tailored suit that cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, 18-karat gold, worth $12,000 easy. She'd noticed because people who stole medical resources the way he did often advertised their success. His pharmaceutical rep was with him, younger, female, carrying a leather case with what Brooke knew contained sample medications and a spreadsheet of kickback percentages. They swept through the ward during morning rounds, and Brooke stood against the wall like everyone else was supposed to, shoulders back, eyes forward. But she watched him. She watched the way his eyes lingered on the unnecessary CT scan order he'd written for room 307, the one Mrs. Chen didn't need because her post-op recovery was textbook normal. She watched him nod to the pharma rep when he thought no one was paying attention. She watched him enter room 314 and read the Navy SEALs chart without actually reading it. When he emerged, he passed directly in front of her, and that's when she felt it, the moment his eyes tracked to her hands. Just a second. A flicker. He saw the surgical scars, the white lines of old lacerations across her knuckles and the back of her right hand, the kind of scars that matched shrapnel patterns from IEDs. The kind of scars that didn't come from ordinary nursing. But he didn't know what he was looking at. That was the only thing keeping her alive. At 8:22 a.m., during the medication review, Brooke refused to sign off on the CT scan order for Mrs. Chen. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just marked it for physician review and added a note in the clinical justification field, post-op imaging not indicated. Patient recovery normal baseline. Recommend physical examination prior to ordering. 3 hours later, Dr. Mercer called her into his office. The space was exactly what she'd expected: diploma from Yale, a few framed awards, a photograph of him at a golf course with someone important, and a shelf lined with pharmaceutical company-branded merchandise. Stress balls with drug names. A pen holder shaped like a molecule. The room smelled like his cologne and old coffee. He was making a phone call when she knocked, his voice low, measured, the voice of someone conducting business he didn't want overheard. "I'll call you back," he said, then looked at Brooke. "Close the door." She closed it. Her composure was perfect. No tension in her jaw. No acceleration in her breathing. Just a nurse, waiting to be spoken to, shoulders slightly rounded to diminish her height, eyes steady but submissive. The mask was seamless. "That CT order," he began, not gesturing for her to sit. "You flagged it." "The clinical data didn't support the imaging," she said. Her voice was soft, deferential, exactly the voice a 6-month tenure nurse should use when speaking to the head of surgical services. "I'm the physician," he said. His tone hadn't changed. He was still smiling, but something underneath it had shifted. "I make those decisions." "Of course, doctor. Mrs. Chen needs that scan. She's recovering normally. Vitals stable, pain controlled, ambulating without assistance. The scan isn't clinically indicated." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. In combat medicine, you counted silence. Silence meant someone was deciding whether you were a threat. "You've been here 6 months, he said finally. "You're a very thorough nurse, Brooke. Very detail-oriented. That's good. But sometimes detail-oriented people can miss the bigger picture. Patient care isn't just about clinical data points. It's about peace of mind. Sometimes families need to know we're doing everything we can. The family hasn't asked for additional imaging. Not yet." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had never been told no by someone without institutional power. "But I like to stay ahead of their concerns. That's what separates good hospitals from great ones. We anticipate. We provide. And we don't second-guess the attending physician." Brooke said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't escalate. That was a lesson learned in places where words got people killed. "I'll order the CT," he continued. "You'll sign off on it. And then we'll both move on from this conversation. Understood?" "Yes, doctor." She left his office and returned to the ward. Her hands were absolutely steady as she pulled Mrs. Chen's chart and reviewed the CT scan order that was now appearing in the electronic system. She didn't feel anything about it. Feeling was a luxury. Feeling was what got you killed or compromised or unable to complete a mission that involved something classified and a Navy SEAL in room 314 who knew too much about operations in Ramadi that had gone wrong in ways that only a few people in the Pentagon understood. She went to the break room at noon, and the space cleared within 15 seconds of her sitting down. But that wasn't today. That was coming. That was the next beat in a sequence she understood perfectly because she'd seen it before in different units with different commanders. First observation. Then pressure. Then isolation. Then elimination. The timeline might vary, but the pattern was inevitable once you became a problem. For now, she sat alone in the break room, and she drank her coffee black, like a soldier, not like a nurse, and she thought about the faded unit patch in her locker and the Navy SEAL 3 floors above her and the fact that she couldn't tell anyone the truth without burning the entire operation. The phone in her pocket buzzed silently. A text from a number with no name, status on asset. She didn't respond. She just deleted the message and finished her coffee. The afternoon light filtered through the Venetian blinds of room 402, casting parallel shadows across the linoleum. Brooke stood at the bedside of Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, reviewing her post-operative medications with her daughter, who leaned forward with the careful attention of someone trying to understand medical language for the first time. Brooke's voice was steady, professional, each word measured. The morphine dose is conservative because of her age. We're monitoring kidney function closely. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that came from holding lives together in places where hospitals didn't have electricity, gestured calmly toward the medication chart. The daughter nodded, relief crossing her face. She had begun to trust this nurse who actually explained things instead of rushing. Then Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. Not entered. Appeared. Like something shifting the air pressure in the room. He was tall, silver-haired at 52, the kind of man whose white coat cost more than most residents made in a month. His eyes moved from Brooke to the daughter, then settled on Brooke with the intensity of a hawk spotting movement in grass. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry authority but not so loud it seemed angry. "Yet. Did you even review basic pharmacology? Because this dosage recommendation suggests you didn't." He stepped closer, positioning himself between Brooke and the patient's daughter, a calculated move that made him the center of attention. "We don't guess at Cedar Creek Medical. We follow protocol." Brooke's jaw clenched. Just once. A single muscle contraction at the hinge of her mandible, visible for maybe 1 second, then gone. Her hands remained perfectly still against the medication cart. No tremor. No color rising in her face. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from military training, from learning to absorb incoming fire without flinching. "The dosage is within standard parameters for post-operative analgesia in geriatric patients," Brooke said quietly. Her voice didn't waver. "I reviewed both current labs and her renal function before administration." Mercer smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just identified a weakness in an opponent's defense. "Well, perhaps your review wasn't thorough enough. Let's make sure Mrs. Chen gets a second opinion, shall we?" He turned to the daughter. "Don't worry. We'll make sure your mother receives appropriate care." The implication hung in the air like smoke, that Brooke's care had been inappropriate. That this nurse couldn't be trusted with basic decisions. The daughter's face shifted. The trust evaporated. Brooke saw it happen in real time, watched the mental math recalculate behind the woman's eyes. She finished her documentation without another word, her pen moving with precise, controlled movements across the clipboard. Professional. Competent. Invisible. That was what the daylight hours demanded. That was what survival looked like when your true identity was locked away in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon. That afternoon, during shift change at 3:45, every nurse at Cedar Creek Medical passed the unit bulletin board. The morning announcements were still there, flu shot reminders, parking lot construction notices. But now, pinned prominently in the center, was a disciplinary write-up with Brooke's name at the top. The date was today. The infraction, medication error, dosage miscalculation, patient safety risk. The recommendation, mandatory retraining. The signature, Dr. Mercer, attending physician. It was fabricated. Every word. Brooke had never made a dosage error in her entire career, civilian or military. 12 years with the Navy Medical Corps. 6 months at Cedar Creek Medical. 0 incidents. But the write-up was professional, formatted correctly, signed by the head of surgery. It looked real because Mercer had made it real on paper. Intent followed by execution. That was how you destroyed someone who couldn't fight back, who couldn't reveal what she actually was. Within an hour, the atmosphere on the orthopedic unit had shifted like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. Brooke felt it in the way nurses' conversations died when she approached the medication room. Felt it in the way 2 LPNs, Kelsey and Rodriguez, both competent, both decent people before Mercer started making phone calls to their supervisors about their future advancement opportunities, suddenly avoided eye contact in the hallway. Felt it in the nickname that began circulating, whispered in the break room where she couldn't hear but absolutely would hear eventually, Little Miss Protocol. As in, Little Miss Protocol thinks she knows better than physicians with 20 years experience. As in, Little Miss Protocol is making waves and needs to be put back in her place. The break room was empty at noon when Brooke carried her lunch tray through the doorway. Small victory. She set her sandwich down at the corner table, the same table where she'd eaten for 6 months, and opened her phone to check messages while she ate. There were 3 messages from her handler, all encrypted, all asking for status updates. She ignored them. 4 nurses entered the break room together. Brooke didn't look up from her sandwich. Within 15 seconds, all 4 stood, dumped their trash, and left without looking in her direction. One of them was Patricia, a charge nurse who had asked Brooke for advice on a difficult for placement just 2 days ago. Now Patricia didn't even glance sideways. The door swung shut with a soft hydraulic hiss. Brooke took a bite of her sandwich. Chewed slowly. Her grip on the fork tightened just slightly, and she pressed her other hand flat against the table for exactly 2 seconds. That was her entire physical response. No anger rising into her face. No moisture in her eyes. Just hands that had held lives together learning to hold back everything else. The fork went back down. The sandwich was returned to its container. She stood, disposed of her untouched lunch, and walked back to the floor. Her patient assignments had been changed. 3 rooms reassigned to other nurses, replaced with post-operative patients she'd never met before, complex cases that would require learning new histories. It was deliberate. Mercer was fragmenting her knowledge, preventing continuity of care, isolating her from any patient who might ask specifically for her by name or whose family might request her again. It was competent sabotage. Strategic isolation dressed up as administrative efficiency. The rest of the afternoon moved like most afternoons at Cedar Creek Medical: vital signs, medication passes, wound checks, documentation. Brooke performed every task with the same mechanical precision she'd brought to every task for the past 6 months. The mask stayed in place. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every single person on the unit now believed she was incompetent. Every reputation was constructed on the foundation of trust, and Mercer had poured acid on Brooks before anyone could question whether the foundation was sound. At 2 o'clock, as Brooke was finishing a dressing change in room 306, the call light illuminated in room 314. The Navy SEAL's room. Her actual assignment. Her real mission. The one patient she could never admit she was protecting. She finished her dressing change with methodical care, sterile technique, proper bandaging, gentle handling of compromised tissue, and moved toward room 314. The unit was quieter now, afternoon shift at that languid midpoint where the morning rush had faded and the evening surge hadn't started. Fluorescent lights cast everything in colorless illumination. The air smelled like antiseptic and the faint mineral tang of fluids. Room 314 was darker than most, curtains drawn halfway. The SEAL, call sign Gator, though she only knew that from classified briefings, lay in the hospital bed with his eyes closed. Recovering well. Progressive healing. No complications to report. The briefing dossier was solid. She began her vitals check. Blood pressure. Pulse. Temperature. Respiratory rate. Then oxygen saturation. The pulse oximeter read 94%. Should have been 98 on room air. She watched the number. 93. 92. It was dropping. His breathing had changed. Shallow. Labored. His eyes opened suddenly, and she saw the panic in them, not fear, but recognition. The look of a man whose body had just turned against him. Gator, she said quietly. Look at me. Tell me what you're feeling. Can't breathe, he managed. Pressure. She was already moving. Tracheal deviation. Jugular venous distension. Breath sounds absent on the right side. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart. He had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac collapse. I'm getting the crash cart, she called out, her voice cutting through the unit with the precise authority of someone trained in military medical response. But she knew that the crash cart would take 90 seconds. He had 4 minutes maximum. He didn't have 90 seconds to spare. Brooke was already opening the emergency thoracic kit from the wall cabinet, hands moving on their own, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. 14-gauge needle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She found the landmarks on his ribs with the touch of someone who had learned anatomy on bodies breathing and not breathing in the chaos of Ramadi. The needle slid in. The hiss of escaping air was immediate, loud, like a pressure valve releasing. Immediately his oxygen saturation began climbing. 95. 97. 99. His eyes opened fully. They locked onto her hands, onto the procedure, onto the impossible precision of someone who had done this before. Not in a simulation. Not in training. Before. In the field. That's Ramadi technique, he whispered, his voice rough but conscious. You were there. Brooke's hands didn't pause, but her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. Recognition. Confirmation. The secret she'd carried for 6 months, the identity locked behind the mask of a civilian nurse, had just been identified by the one patient she'd been ordered to protect. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway as the crash cart arrived. He stopped. Watched. Saw the successful intervention, the oxygen saturation climbing steadily into normal range, the Navy SEAL conscious and stable. Saw the way Brooke's hands had moved with absolute precision, with the technical knowledge that came from somewhere far deeper than any nursing program. Mercer's expression shifted from anger to calculation. That was always the worst moment. When an antagonist stopped thinking with rage and started thinking with strategy. When they understood they'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a troublesome nurse. And that's when the real nightmare began. The vital signs monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Brooke checked the numbers on the screen, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate holding at 68, blood pressure stable at 118/74. Room 314. The Navy SEAL patient lay motionless, sedation keeping him anchored to the bed, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. She'd been checking on him every 2 hours since the incident 3 days ago when he arrived with shrapnel wounds from Ramadi that should have killed him. They didn't. Not with her there. She adjusted the foredrip, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had performed this motion 10,000 times before. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that sickly pale glow that hospitals specialized in, and the smell of antiseptic hung heavy enough to taste. She was 2 minutes into her assessment when she heard it, a wet, gasping sound coming from his throat. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 92. 89, the monitor's tempo accelerated, beeping faster now, urgency creeping into the electronic voice. His body stiffened. His breathing turned shallow, desperate, like a man drowning in air. Tension pneumothorax. She didn't call for help. She didn't hesitate. Her hands were already moving toward the crash cart, muscle memory taking over, the kind of memory that came from 3 tours in a combat zone where you either moved fast or didn't move again. Collapsed lung. Air filling the space between lung and chest wall. Pressure building. Heart being crushed by the expanding cavity. If she didn't decompress it in the next 90 seconds, his heart would stop. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand before she consciously reached for it. She'd done this exact procedure in a burning Humvee outside Ramadi with nothing but field equipment and the smell of diesel and blood. This was a climate-controlled hospital room. This was going to be easier. She tore open his hospital gown. Her eyes found the landmarks, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She felt his ribs beneath her fingers, counted them with the precision of a surgeon reading a map she'd memorized years ago. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, sliding between the ribs with resistance, then the hiss. The sound of pressurized air escaping. The sound of a man's lungs remembering how to inflate. His oxygen saturation climbed. 91, 95. 97, his chest expanded. His breathing deepened. The monitor's frantic beeping settled back into a calm, steady rhythm. Then his eyes opened. Not the glazed, sedated eyes of a sleeping patient. Focused eyes. Alert eyes. The kind of eyes that had seen things, understood things, knew exactly what had just happened and how it had happened. He looked directly at her, and his voice came out as a whisper, rough and stripped raw. That's Ramadi technique. You were there. It wasn't a question. Brooke's jaw tightened, a hairline fracture in her composure, nothing more. No tremor in her hands. No catch in her breath. She met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and secured the needle with tape, her movements precise and controlled. Rest. Your lung needs time to re-expand. Her voice was flat. Professional. The voice of a nurse, nothing more. But he was still watching her. He knew. The recognition was alive in his eyes, burning like a fire she couldn't extinguish. She documented the procedure in his chart with clinical precision, time, technique, vital signs before and after, patient's response. The words were sterile. By the book. They told you nothing about what had actually happened in that room. They told you nothing about a nurse with surgical scars on her hands who could decompress a pneumothorax with the kind of muscle memory that only came from doing it in combat. They told you nothing about a Navy SEAL lying in a hospital bed who had just recognized a ghost from Ramadi. She finished charting and turned toward the door. The unit clerk was already waiting in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. She saw Brooke emerge and ended the call with 2 words, "She's here." Then she walked away without meeting Brooke's eyes. Within an hour, Brooke's name appeared on the reassignment notice. Night shift. Orthopedic wing. Effective immediately. She learned about it the same way everyone else did, from the staffing board posted outside the break room. Not a conversation with the nursing director. Not a meeting. Just a notice, clinical and efficient as a surgical strike. The nursing director was in her office when Brooke knocked. Margaret Cho had always struck Brooke as fair, the kind of administrator who believed in her staff until given reason not to. Now her hands were folded on her desk, and her expression had taken on the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script they hadn't written. "I saved that patient's life," Brooke said. No inflection. No plea. Just a statement of fact. Margaret's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "Dr. Mercer has concerns about your clinical judgment. He believes there are gaps in your understanding of our protocols." The night shift reassignment will give you time to review our procedures and recalibrate. She paused, and in that pause was everything: sympathy, resignation, the weight of someone caught between what they believed and what they'd been told to do. It's effective immediately. I followed protocol. The reassignment is effective immediately, Brooke. Margaret's eyes carried an apology her voice couldn't afford to give. Brooke stood there for 3 seconds. 4. She could feel the explanation building in her chest, the truth about who she was, why she was here, what the reassignment really meant. The Navy SEAL had recognized her. Mercer would have seen that recognition. He would know, or be close to knowing, that the unassuming nurse with the steady hands was something other than what her badge said she was. The assignment wasn't just to monitor a patient anymore. The assignment was becoming exposure. But she couldn't reveal the truth. The moment she did, the mission failed. The SEAL remained a loose end. The intelligence he carried, whatever it was about the compromised operation in Ramadi, would remain unverified and uncontained. Blowing her cover meant more than losing her job. It meant losing the asset. It meant people dying. So she said nothing. She turned and walked out of the office, her hand steady, her face a mask. That night, she worked the orthopedic wing alone. The patients in post-op care, recovering from hip replacements and rotator cuff repairs, didn't need the kind of vigilance that came from monitoring a classified asset. She moved between rooms like a ghost, checking vitals, adjusting medications, answering call lights. Simple work. Work that any competent nurse could do. Work that didn't matter. Around 2 a.m., she stood at the window of the medication room, looking down at the parking lot below. Rain had started to fall, hammering against the windows like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch. She could see the streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt, turning the world below into something abstract and distant. Her phone vibrated. Text message. Unknown number, your car. 5 minutes. Come alone. She didn't hesitate. She didn't question it. Brooke was a lot of things: a nurse, a captain, an operative, a ghost, but she wasn't the kind of person who waited for answers. She went looking for them. The parking garage was empty. Her car sat in the back corner where she always parked it, a grey sedan that was designed to be invisible. As she approached, a figure separated from the shadows of the adjacent pillar. Tall. Military bearing. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change around him. Nightingale 6, he said. Not a question. She stopped 5 feet away. That patient recognized the technique. He did. The figure stepped closer, and she could see his face now, mid-40s, scar tissue along his left temple, eyes that had the specific exhaustion that came from command. Dr. Mercer has already made 3 calls. 1 to the hospital administrator. 1 to the nursing director. 1 to someone at a private equity firm we're watching. He paused. He knows something's wrong. He doesn't know what yet. But he knows. I'm blown, Brooke said flatly. Not yet. But you will be within 72 hours unless we move. He handed her a phone, old, military grade, the kind with encrypted channels. The SEAL security has been upgraded. Your cover is being adjusted. You need to maintain your position at Cedar Creek for another 48 hours. After that, extraction. And the mission. Still active. You held it together long enough for us to get what we needed from the patient. He's given us the names. 3 officers. 1 active cell in the network. The figure's eyes held hers. You did good work, Captain. Now you just need to survive long enough for extraction. He was gone before she could respond, dissolving back into the shadows like he'd never been there at all. Brooke stood alone in the parking garage, the encrypted phone in her pocket, the reassignment notice in her locker, and the knowledge that everything had changed in the time it took a needle to decompress a lung and a Navy SEAL to whisper 5 words. Rain drummed on the concrete outside. She sat in her car with the doors locked, the steering wheel cool under her palms, and waited for dawn to come. The orthopedic wing at Cedar Creek Medical existed in a state of suspended animation after midnight. Fluorescent panels cast their sterile glow across empty hallways where the daytime chaos had evaporated into silence. No visitors, no family members, no attending physicians making rounds with their entourages of residents trailing behind like anxious birds. Just Brooke, her scrubs still damp from a 12-hour shift, moving through the corridors with the mechanical precision of someone running on fumes and muscle memory. Her hands moved from patient to patient, vitals, charting the 1,000 small gestures that filled the night, while her mind occupied a different geography entirely. Ramadi. The compound. The SEAL's eyes opening in recognition as she performed the needle decompression, his whispered words hanging in the air like a tripwire she'd just stepped on. The clock above the nursing station read 2:11 a.m. She'd been reassigned here 2 days ago, moved from the surgical floor like a chess piece being removed from play. Mercer had done it with surgical precision, no dramatic announcement, just a phone call to her at home saying her skill set was better utilized in orthopedics, effective immediately. She'd understood the message. You're being isolated. You're being removed from witnesses. By 3:08 a.m., the hospital had taken on the quality of a mausoleum. The ventilators wheezed their steady rhythm in the patient rooms. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator dinged and fell silent again. She sat at the nursing station, documentation spread before her, patient flow sheets, medication logs, the endless paperwork that constituted proof of her existence in this place. Her hand steady. Her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She didn't see the email arrive at 5:12 a.m. Didn't watch it propagate through the hospital's administrative servers. Didn't know that at 6:41 a.m., Dr. Mercer would be sitting in the hospital board's conference room on the 4th floor, presenting his case with the confidence of a man who had dismantled careers before and would do it again. The presentation was immaculate. Mercer had constructed a narrative as precise as any surgical incision. He laid out the fabricated medication errors first, documented, dated, time-stamped. Oxytocin dosage allegedly 5 times the prescribed amount on March 14, insulin administration error on March 19. Then came the disciplinary write-ups, each one a small fiction built on a foundation of calculated detail. He'd even included what he called concerning behavioral incidents, her refusal to authorize unnecessary CT scans, her repeated questioning of clinical judgment, her isolation from the team. The board members listened with expressions of professional concern. One of them, the chief financial officer, had already been convinced by Mercer's argument that her refusal to authorize procedures was costing the hospital revenue. Mercer presented that angle with the delicacy of someone handling a loaded weapon. Cost per patient day is up 15% since Ms. Sullivan arrived, he said, catching himself before using her rank. Her protocols are creating inefficiency. 2 nurses sat in the back row of the conference room, their faces a study in calculated shame. Mercer had approached each of them separately over the past 48 hours with the same offer: sign these complaint forms about Brooke's erratic behavior, and your husband's gambling debts disappear. Your daughter's student loans get handled quietly. Mercer knew everything. He'd made it his business to know things about people. The nurses had signed. By 6:45 a.m., the board had voted. The decision was unanimous. Immediate termination for creating instability in patient care protocols. Mercer had already drafted the letter to HR before the vote concluded. At 7:11 a.m., an HR representative named Sandra Chen, who'd never met Brooke before and who looked genuinely uncomfortable with what she was about to do, called her into an office on the 2nd floor. The termination letter sat on a desk the color of pale ash. Brooke's eyes moved across it without seeming to absorb the words. Medication errors. Policy violations. Unprofessional conduct. The language was bureaucratic, designed to prevent argument. It was also a complete fabrication. Can I see the specific incidents? Brooke's voice emerged calm, the voice of someone asking about the weather rather than her own destruction. Sandra slid a folder across the desk. Brooke opened it and saw the medication error reports with her signature forged at the bottom in handwriting that was almost correct but not quite. Almost was enough. She recognized the trap. To argue would be to reveal she knew the documents were false, which would require explaining how she knew they were false, which would require revealing her true role at Cedar Creek Medical, which would burn the entire operation and leave the seal unprotected. She closed the folder. "This didn't happen," she said quietly. "The board reviewed the documentation," Sandra replied, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news 100 times. "I'm very sorry." Brooke sat back down. The room felt like it was rotating slowly around her. She'd taken hits before, real hits, the kind where metal and fire were involved, but this was different. This was calculated. Personal. A man she'd never threatened directly, who she'd simply outmaneuvered in his own game, had decided to burn her entire civilian identity to the ground rather than lose. 20 minutes later, she was at her locker in the staff room. The combination dial felt cold under her fingers. She gathered her belongings, the few personal items she'd kept here, the book she'd been pretending to read during breaks, the locker mirror with its small crack running diagonally across the reflective surface like a scar. And then, beneath it all, the faded unit patch she'd sewn into the lining of her jacket months ago. Nightingale 6. The call sign from another life, another world, another version of herself. She stared at it for exactly 4 seconds, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the embroidered insignia. 6 years of service. 3 combat tours. The bronze star with Vela still packed in a safe deposit box she'd rented under an assumed name. The purple heart earned when shrapnel had carved a path across her ribs. And now all of it, the medals, the commendations, the citations, meant nothing against a man with access to a printer and a willingness to forge documents. The patch felt like an artifact from an archaeological dig. Something that had belonged to someone else entirely. By 3:44 a.m. 2 nights later, Brooke sat alone in a diner called Morton's on the outskirts of Raleigh, a place that existed in the fluorescent haze between night and morning, where nobody asked questions and the waitress worked with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from 17 years of the same job. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago, the surface developing a thin skin of congealed cream. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window, hollow-eyed, the sharp angles of her face thrown into harsh relief by the streetlight outside. She almost didn't recognize herself. The woman in the glass looked like someone who'd been quietly demolished from the inside, her structure still intact but her foundations completely compromised. The kind of damage that wouldn't show on an X-ray but would leave her unstable forever. The waitress, name tag reading Phyllis, refilled the coffee without speaking, her movements carrying the muscle memory of a million identical transactions. She could tell when someone needed silence. She could tell when words would be an intrusion. Phyllis disappeared back into the kitchen where the grill hummed its steady song and the exhaust fan rattled like a dying engine. Brooke's hands lay flat on the table, palms down. These hands had held hemorrhaging wounds closed. These hands had performed emergency procedures under fire. These hands had saved lives when the only option was move or die. And these same hands had been incapable of defending one's civilian reputation against a man with better access to institutional machinery. The unit patch sat in her jacket pocket, sewn into the lining where it would stay hidden. Where it would remain a relic from someone else's existence. She thought about calling her extraction team, about speaking the phrase that would activate an exit protocol set for 2 days from now. Instead, she stared at her reflection and wondered if 6 years of sacrifice and a chest full of medals meant nothing when balanced against a man willing to lie. The diner hummed around her, refrigerator compressor, fluorescent ballast, the low murmur of a radio in the kitchen playing news she wasn't listening to. She was alone in a way that went deeper than physical isolation. Alone in a way that felt permanent. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, hammering the parking lot with the sound of static. Brooke watched the water bead on the windshield of her car in the lot, each droplet catching and reflecting the streetlight before sliding away into nothing. That was her now. Reflection without substance. Light without heat. A captain dressed as a nurse, becoming neither, becoming nothing. She raised the cold coffee to her lips and drank anyway. The audit flagged her at 4:51 p.m. on a Tuesday. A routine background check on civilian medical staff, standard protocol, cross-referencing Social Security numbers against federal databases. Brooke Sullivan's clearance level appeared in the system like a ghost rising from a grave, secret, eyes only, active Pentagon sponsorship, medical division. The database triggered 3 automated alerts simultaneously. Within 16 minutes, those alerts reached the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. Within 34 minutes, they reached the FBI field office in Charlotte. Within 2 hours, 2 special agents were already in Raleigh, one driving north on I-95, the other coordinating with hospital administration. The machinery of federal response had been set in motion by a single data point, a nurse who wasn't supposed to exist in this system at all. The hospital administrator, Margaret Chen, received the phone call at 5:23 p.m. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Morrison, FBI Counterintelligence Division. He did not ask permission to enter Cedar Creek Medical. He stated facts. A classified operative was or had been employed at this facility. An investigation was opening immediately. Patient privacy would be maintained. Cooperation was expected. The call lasted for minutes. Margaret sat in her office for 6 minutes after hanging up, her hand still on the receiver, before she called security. The emergency meeting convened at 7:15 p.m. in the administrative conference room on the 4th floor. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Dr. Mercer was already there, still in his white coat, looking agitated because the evening administrator had interrupted his schedule without explanation. FBI Special Agent Morrison stood near the window, his colleague, Agent Reeves, a woman with the bearing of someone who had moved through hostile territory before, stood near the door. The Navy SEAL arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a young corporal in dress blues. His name was Marcus Halloway. His rank was Lieutenant Commander. His left leg was still healing, the surgical scars visible on his calf where Brooke's needle had gone in on that night shift 3 weeks prior. His eyes had the clarity of someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer and had decided not to flinch anymore. Agent Morrison spoke first. "Dr. Chen, we appreciate your immediate cooperation. Lieutenant Commander Halloway is here because he has information relevant to our investigation." Morrison nodded slightly. Halloway wheeled himself closer to the table, his shoulders squared, his dress uniform immaculate, the uniform of a man about to make a statement. "Captain Brooke Sullivan," Halloway said, his voice the color of worn leather and sand. Her call sign in Ramadi was Nightingale 6. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, attached to JSOC Task Force 121. 2013 to 2015. I was Sword 2 in her unit. When I took shrapnel in my lung during a firefight in the Jolin district, he paused. His hands gripped the wheelchair arms. She pulled me out under active fire. 300 meters through an active engagement. Applied a pressure dressing that held until medevac. Recognized her technique the night she saved my life again in your hospital. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. That's not a civilian skill. That's Ramadi. Dr. Mercer had gone very still. Margaret Chen's face had gone pale. A Marine colonel stood from the back corner of the room, a man neither Chen nor Mercer had noticed entering. His uniform bore the insignia of rank and service record that spanned 32 years. He carried a personnel file, thick with redacted pages, stamped across the top, classification, eyes only. "Captain Brooke Sullivan," the colonel said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. Serial number 8 for 7291 Ren, commissioned through the Naval Academy, 2006. Combat Medical Training, Special Operations Track. Tour 1, Fallujah, Jolin District, 2011 to 2012. Tour 2, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2013. Tour 3, Integrated Operations, Task Force 121, 2014 to 2015. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The room held its breath. Purple Heart. Another pause. Longer. Navy Commendation Medal for actions during Operation Phantom Fury, which saw 847 enemy combatants neutralized and 0 friendly casualties in her operational sector. The colonel closed the file. That's your nurse. Dr. Mercer's face had drained of color. His mouth opened. Closed. Those are fabricated, he said, his voice uncertain for the first time since this meeting began. I don't know what this is about, but those records are. Agent Reeves stepped forward. She held an evidence folder. Inside were printouts of digital files, metadata visible in timestamps and modification dates. Personnel files. Disciplinary write-ups. Medical certifications. All stamped with Dr. Mercer's digital signature. All forged within the past 8 days. All backdated to create a paper trail of misconduct by a federal operative. Once we determined Ms. Sullivan's status, Agent Reeves said, her voice precise as a surgical instrument, we conducted a warrant on your office computers, Dr. Mercer. You attempted to cover your tracks. You knew who she was. You knew about the clearance flag. You forged personnel records to justify her termination and discredit her testimony. She held up another document. We also found your billing records. 14 years of false claims to Medicare. 17 pharmaceutical companies paying kickbacks to your personal account. Unnecessary procedures billed to 3,847 patients. Over $4.2 million in fraudulent billings and kickbacks. Her eyes were the color of storm water. That's healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and attempting to interfere with a federal operative. Those are the charges we're beginning with. 2 FBI agents entered from the corridor. They were not large, not particularly imposing, but they moved with the precision of people trained to arrest suspects who understood they had no choice. Mercer stood slowly. His hands were shaking. His expensive watch, a $12,000 Omega Seamaster, the kind he wore to highlight his status, caught the fluorescent light as he raised them. You don't understand, he began, his voice the texture of ice cracking under pressure. I was protecting the hospital. She was unstable. Those complaints were. You can explain that to the federal court, Agent Morrison said. He was already reading Mercer his rights, the words flowing like a script Mercer had heard 1,000 times on television but never expected to hear directed at himself. Certain inalienable rights. Right to remain silent. Right to an attorney. The words hung in the administrative conference room like a funeral bell. The handcuffs were silver and caught the light as they were applied. His wrists, so accustomed to the weight of expensive watches and surgical instruments, now bore the weight of federal custody. The walk from the 4th-floor conference room to the main corridor took 90 seconds. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. Cedar Creek Medical's entire day shift had been dismissed at 5:06 p.m., told to leave immediately, no exceptions. The night shift had arrived at 6:56 p.m. to find the lobby swarming with federal agents and uniformed military personnel. They assembled in the main corridor without being asked to do so. The nurses who had submitted false complaints to Mercer, Donna Carmichael and Patricia Huang, stood near the emergency department in trance, their faces the color of people who had just realized the magnitude of what they had done. Their hands covered their mouths. One of them was crying. Dr. Mercer passed them on his way to the exit. He did not look at them. He did not look at anything. His head was lowered, his expensive suit wrinkled, the perp walk of a man whose entire architectural identity had collapsed into rubble. A photographer from the Raleigh News and Observer snapped 17 photographs. Every one of them would run on the front page the next morning. 6 months later, a witness reported seeing Dr. Harrison Mercer in the parking lot of an industrial complex off Fayetteville Street. He was loading pharmaceutical delivery boxes into the side of a white van. The van had the logo of Midwest Medical Supply painted on the side in faded blue letters. He was wearing a polo shirt that didn't fit quite right, the kind issued to delivery drivers at warehouses. No nameplate. No title. A warehouse manager, a man named Derek who was 28 years old and had never heard of Dr. Mercer before, called him Harry and asked him to sort inventory in the back. The pay was $16 an hour. The benefits kicked in after 90 days. His attorney had negotiated a plea deal. 23 months, federal prison, restitution to be determined by court order. His medical license was revoked permanently. The medical board's decision was unanimous. His name appeared in databases of sanctioned practitioners, the kind that prospective patients could search online. The two nurses who had submitted false complaints against Brooke were offered immunity in exchange for testimony. They took it the same day they were asked. Donna Carmichael and Patricia Huang sat in a federal courthouse and described in detail how Dr. Mercer had threatened their job security, offered them schedule preferences in exchange for their cooperation, and provided them with specific language to use in the complaints. They wept on the stand. The jury found them credible. The conviction was unanimous on all counts. Cedar Creek Medical settled with 1,847 patients who had undergone unnecessary procedures at Mercer's recommendation. The settlement totaled $47.3 million. The hospital's insurance covered $31 million of it. The remaining $16.3 million came from the hospital's general reserves. Margaret Chen appeared on local news and made a statement about institutional oversight and the importance of protecting patient safety. She did not mention Brooke Sullivan by name. The call came to the Pentagon's Office of Medical Affairs on a Wednesday morning in October. The President's scheduling office was requesting the presence of Captain Brooke Sullivan, retired, for a medal ceremony in the Oval Office. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2:56 p.m. Full dress uniform required. One guest was permitted. Brooke's response, when asked, was immediate: the Navy SEAL. If he's not there, I'm not there. The Pentagon complied without hesitation. The Oval Office smelled of furniture polish and the faint copper undertone of fresh paint from recent renovations. Brooke stood in her dress uniform, the Navy working uniform Type 1, the blue-gray color like the Atlantic in winter, with her medals arranged in ascending order of prestige on her left breast. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Commendation Medal for Operation Phantom Fury. Her ribbons were parallel to the floor, her bearing rigid, her hands at her sides. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Halloway stood in his own dress uniform beside her, his legs still healing but bearing weight without a crutch, his bearing that of a man who had learned to stand on fractured foundations. The Marine Colonel was present. Representatives from Task Force 121 were present. 2 admirals. A senator. The President. The President's hands, when she shook Brooke's hand, were warm and steady. He pinned the additional commendation to her uniform, a Navy cross with the ribbon the color of red wine and gold leaf. For exceptional heroism and valor in the face of fire, both in theater and in the protection of national interests, he said. His voice carried the weight of historical moment. Your service in both capacities exemplifies the highest standards of the United States military. He paused. Captain Sullivan, your country is grateful. Brooke's face, which had been an unreadable mask through every moment of the past 6 months, showed emotion for the first time since the diner. Not tears. Something else. A slight smile. The smile of someone who had been vindicated not by the removal of her enemy but by the elevation of her truth before the highest office in the land. Behind the President, through the window of the Oval Office, the Washington Monument gleamed like a pillar of light against the October sky. For just a moment, Brooke thought of the cold diner window where she had sat at 3 a.m., her reflection hollow and unrecognizable, questioning whether any of it had mattered. This moment was the answer. The ceremony lasted 18 minutes. The photographs lasted another 12. Then Brooke was walking back through the corridors of the White House, her new medal catching the light, Halloway beside her, neither of them speaking because there was nothing that needed to be said. Words were the tools of people still trying to convince themselves. They had already been convinced. Cedar Creek Medical's main entrance looked exactly the same as it had looked when Brooke pulled into the parking lot 6 months ago for her final shift. The same landscaping. The same doors. The same air of institutional certainty. She was wearing her dress uniform when she entered, not as a nurse but as a captain, the distinction visible in every line of her posture. The nursing director met her in the lobby. The woman's name was Susan Okafor. She was 61 years old and had worked at Cedar Creek for 24 years. Captain Sullivan, Susan said, her voice steady but her eyes damp. I want to say, I need to apologize. You didn't know, Brooke said, and her voice was different now. The mask dropped completely, authority moving through the syllables like an electrical current. He was your supervisor. You made the choice to trust him. That's not an apology offense. The break room where everyone had abandoned her was now crowded with people standing to shake her hand. Nurses she had worked with. Respiratory therapists. Lab techs. The young resident who had questioned whether she had made a mistake during the needle decompression. They stood in line, awkward and sincere, their handshakes firm. Brooke accepted each one without ceremony, her face the color of someone accepting what had already been decided. A young nurse, her name was Elena, she was in her second year of practice, she looked overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of the moment, stood near the back. She was watching Brooke with an expression that Brooke recognized immediately, the look of someone trying to understand how survival happened, how competence was built, how you held your ground when the world was conspiring against you. Brooke placed her hand on Elena's shoulder. The touch was brief, the gesture simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most, Brooke said. Her voice was the color of steel wire. Remember that. When this place breaks you. When someone like Mercer tries to convince you that integrity doesn't matter. Remember that the people who know the cost of staying still are the ones who move. You understand? Elena nodded. Brooke released her shoulder. The walk back through Cedar Creek Medical's main corridor took her past the trauma bays where she had worked her night shifts, past the surgical unit where Dr. Mercer had publicly humiliated her, past the administrative office where she had been terminated. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The heart monitors beeped in their various rhythms. The ventilators wheezed their oxygen-rich breath. The hospital continued operating with the indifference of all institutions, healing some people, breaking others, consuming everyone with its demand for constant function. Brooke pushed through the glass doors into the October afternoon. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, turning the sky the color of amber and rust. Her dress uniform caught the light. The Navy cross on her chest reflected gold. Her faded unit patch, the one she had sewn inside her jacket lining all those months ago, was now displayed openly on her shoulder, her true identity no longer a secret to protect but a badge to carry forward. She walked toward the parking lot without looking back at the hospital. Behind her, through the glass, she could see Elena standing at the window, watching her leave. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who understands that heroes walk among us, sometimes in scrubs, sometimes in shadows, sometimes in places where nobody thinks to look. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors who hold the line when it matters most. Like this video if you believe that truth ultimately prevails. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were?